How do you get someone to tell you their story? You buy them a beer. How do you get a place to tell you its story? In my case, it starts with its beer. I was drawn to the city of Cincinnati largely by the tattered beauty of Over the Rhine. That's a complicated place. The neighborhood of Over the Rhine has been troubled by racial conflict and by heated debates over how a city should handle addiction, poverty, homelessness, and then gentrification. All of these are very important issues. I lack both the time and the credentials to address any of them, so I'm not going to. Instead, I want to share a very simple concept that I learned in over a decade of advocating for Over the Rhine. And that's the importance of letting a place tell its story. Over the Rhine is a little bit larger than the French Quarter in New Orleans. Almost every building in it was constructed between 1830 and 1910. It is one of the largest, most significant, and most beautiful urban historic districts in the United States. It's also situated immediately between Cincinnati's Central Business District and the Uptown area, which are the two largest employment hubs in greater Cincinnati. So if you're from somewhere other than Cincinnati, you probably assume that this beautiful historic district that is so strategically located has long been the jewel of the city of Cincinnati. Be a safe assumption, but you would be wrong. Over the Rhine actually owes its historic integrity mostly to luck. Cincinnatians wanted to destroy it multiple times over the course of 50 plus years. Those plans always fell apart due to municipal incompetence rather than better judgment. It was just easier to let it fall apart, both physically and socially, rather than to either fix it or destroy it. So, for generations, it fell apart. In 2006, the National Trust for Historic Preservation put Over the Rhine on its list of 11 most endangered places. Now, this list is usually compiled of single structures that are historically significant and in imminent peril. But the Trust put the entire neighborhood on the list because at the time, we were destroying more historic buildings in Over the Rhine than constituted entire historic districts in other cities. There were hundreds of vacant buildings, and it had the highest crime rate in the city of Cincinnati. A series of police shootings in 2001 led to protests and then to riots, which then exacerbated every pre-existing condition. In short, in the early 2000s, it was in bad shape. It was bad enough that a lot of people renewed talk of large-scale demolition. Now, originally, I come from a small historic town that had fallen on hard times. Underneath years of disinvestment, it was quaint, it was charming, and it had a rich history. But throughout my youth, I watched the citizens of that town destroy 150 plus years of beauty and history. As a kid, I watched a cinder block building go up on the site of a demolished 19th century opera house. I watched bulldozers push away the remains of a grand hotel that presidents stayed in to make way for mobile home lots. I heard this called progress. I heard this called reinvestment. What it was bad decisions for short-term reasons. Years later, as an adult, people from that town came to me and they said that they wanted to attract tourism there, and they asked for my advice. And unfortunately, I couldn't help them. Because once you have destroyed all of those layers of physical history that give a place its soul, you can't ever get that back. I spent my childhood watching a place abort its future because it failed to respect its history. That left a wound in my psyche. So when I saw Cincinnatians making a similar calculation about over the Rhine, I wanted to do whatever I could to help stop that destruction. For me, that first step was to join a fledgling organization called the Brewery District. The Brewery District was very grassroots. Our funding consisted of members taking turns buying beer for the meetings. Our goal was to encourage the redevelopment of dozens of vacant buildings in North over the Rhine. Our challenges were a complete, absolute lack of any money or political support. Public opinion was also against us, because most Cincinnatians viewed the building stock that made up a lot of this area as just a bunch of old industrial buildings. So, assessing our challenges, it was pretty clear that neither money nor political support was going to fall from the sky. What we needed to do was find a way to change perception of this place without actually having to change the place. So how do you do that? How do you change how people see a place without actually changing the view? I'll answer that with an analogy. If you're ever kidnapped, your best chance of survival is to humanize yourself to your abductor. Create an emotional connection with that person that makes it harder for them to harm you. Now, ultimately, we were trying to save a place from people who wanted to destroy it. Strategically, that's not much different from trying to convince a kidnapper not to murder you. So we went about trying to humanize this place. We did that by looking for stories that were going to make it relatable to people. So we looked towards that most relatable, unifying force known to the Midwest: beer. The northern part of the Rhine actually contains the largest collection of 19th century brewery buildings of any place in the United States. All of those old industrial buildings that were being dismissed as unimportant are actually part of a very rich brewing history. We had great stories of this place. The next step was to figure out how to disseminate those stories. Now, over the Rhine at this point was not as scary as most Cincinnatians thought, but it was objectively dangerous. Shootings were common, gun battles would occasionally just erupt in the streets. So we had a good story about a bunch of dilapidated buildings in a high-crime neighborhood. Couldn't afford a PR campaign or an ad campaign. So how do we get that story out? Well, we did the obvious thing you do in a neighborhood that scares the hell out of people. We gave walking tours of it. Now, there were people who thought this was a bad idea to bring a bunch of suburbanites down into a neighborhood where gunfire might erupt for no reason and where sewer rats roamed the streets like gangs, to then take these people several stories below ground into unlit beer cellars underneath dilapidated buildings. And they may have had a point. I can assure you, both as a lawyer and as the person who orchestrated this, that no responsible lawyer would have let it happen. Nevertheless, I drafted a waiver and we did it anyway, and it was a success. Those first tours sold out, as did the next tours and the tours after that. And then we added additional events. And many of the people that came to these tours and events, they did exactly what we wanted. They walked away with a different perspective. They started to care about this place. They started to relate to this place. They started to form a bond with this place. We were changing public opinion. Starting out with zero budget, we shifted public opinion. Television stations started paying attention to what we were doing. And so did local reporters, and they started to cover it because it resonated with viewers and readers. And as that started to happen, members of City Council started returning our phone calls and actually offering to help. As the years went on, Over the Rhine actually developed a very lucrative and competitive tourism business. Tens of thousands of people have seen our historic brewery buildings. This story of Over the Rhine's brewing history started to break beyond the region, started to get picked up by national news outlets. It's been covered by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. It's been in books and documentaries. Just within the past year, I have given interviews to German journalists and to a film crew from England about our brewing history. This message that started with some very dubious tours is now starting to spread around the globe. And as that has happened, we've actually increased the perceived value of a place simply through old-fashioned storytelling. Now, at the same time that this was happening, there was a very well-funded and much more conventional form of urban renewal taking hold in the other end of the neighborhood. And this effort got kicked off by changing the name of part of the neighborhood to the Gateway Quarter. And somebody created a logo, and there was an ad campaign, and they started to tell people about this great new place called the Gateway Quarter. Now, this is classic corporate rebranding applied to a neighborhood. And it's actually become a very common aspect of how we approach urban revitalization in America. Right now, there are neighborhoods all across this country that are being renamed by urban planners and developers. Now, when you rename a place like that, what you're trying to do is change perception of it. When we were doing history tours, we were trying to also change perception. There is, however, a big difference in philosophy between these two approaches. If you take this branding approach, what you're doing when you rename a neighborhood is you declare that it is a brand new place. You declare, by implication, that everything that came before is now just a bad, fading memory. You devalue that place as it exists, and you devalue its history. You dehumanize it. You make it easier to destroy its historic buildings. You even make it easier to displace its residents and its businesses. By contrast, this storytelling approach that we took is really just a way of starting your approach towards transforming perception of a neighborhood by looking for the inherent value in that place. That approach starts by walking around the neighborhood and looking for what makes it intriguing, to look for its stories, to celebrate what's come before. Now, this is not an argument against change. This is an argument for approaching change differently, for approaching it with just a little bit more humility. For me, this is all hindsight perspective. I'm not going to tell you that we took the approach that we did because we were woke. We took the approach that we did because we were broke. But sometimes you stumble onto the right path for the wrong reasons. My goal was to save physical buildings. And I latched on to brewing history as a pragmatic way to go about that. And it was effective. But this humility that I talk about as applied to architecture, it also applies to the living residents and the business owners that are obviously also part of a place's story. if we just approach how we think about reinvesting in American cities that are suffering from decades of disinvestment with just a little bit more humility, if we just start by valuing what's there and what's been there, we wind up making much more thoughtful, much more effective, and generally wiser decisions about what happens to and in those places. We often say, I discovered this new bar or diner or neighborhood. It's something that we say, I discovered it. But get over yourself and stop saying it, because you did not discover that bar that's been there for decades. You did not discover that restaurant that's been run by the same family for 4 generations. You definitely didn't discover that neighborhood that was built by immigrants 170 years ago. You may be able to leave some positive impact on it, but you're just a guest, and you should be honored and humbled to be a guest. And that applies whether you're a customer or you're a developer. Old places are like old people. They're full of stories, and not every one of them is a gem. But if you have the humility to listen to the stories that a place has to tell, it's like having a beer with a stranger. That stranger starts to morph from just a stranger into a fully formed human being with a lifetime of experiences that have come before. And your life will be richer as a result. And you will never again be able to see that person as just a stranger.